This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
My guest today has a fascinating story. She ended up at the age of 32 with a business with $400,000 in debt after the death of her first husband. She climbed out of debt, built a substantial real estate portfolio, and now she uses all of the lessons she learned during that period to help women and men create better financial options for themselves and their families. Her advice is great for anyone struggling with debt and money questions, male or female. What exactly is her story? Let's find out. Let's get started. Who are you and what do you do?
So I am Doris Belland. I am a financial literacy educator. And in a nutshell, people say, what is that? So in a nutshell, I teach workshops and I run a women's money group to help people rock their finances and feel a lot more confident about money.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, Doris. We're
pleasure.
In my Ottawa office recording this, which is where you are based out of.
Mm-hmm.
So I encourage everyone listening to this to go to Amazon and get a copy of your book, Protect Your Purse. Shared lessons for women, avoid financial messes, stop emotional bankruptcies, and take charge of your money, which has, in my view, the most page-turning first 8 chapters I've ever read in any personal finance book. It reads more like a novel than a personal finance book to me. So can you briefly summarize those first 8 chapters? You know, how did you end up at the age of 32 with a business that had all of this debt?
Right. I was a doctoral candidate. I was working on my PhD in my 20s when my first husband became very seriously ill. He'd had cancer the whole time I'd known him, but it flared up and got much more serious at that time. So I took what I thought was going to be a 1-year leave of absence to go support him, his business. It was having a hard time because he was so ill. And then the cancer just kept going. He just deteriorated. So in fact, I never went back. 6 years later, he died, and I found myself inheriting a business that required him to run it, the engine. So I had essentially no income, and I inherited mostly $400,000 of his business debt. So that took my life. I was supposed to be a professor, right? Things were going so well. It was fully funded, and it changed everything because now I find myself with nothing. I'm bereft. I'm $400,000 in debt. So what I did is I at that moment, I made a decision. I thought, I'm going to pay this off and I'm going to figure out what just happened to make sure it never happens again. So I paid off all that debt in 2 years and then have spent the intervening years studying how does money work? How do we prevent this kind of trauma from happening to anyone? And then how do we build a rock solid financial foundation?
And so, and it's quite a story. So that's why I say you got to read the first 8 chapters. You've done a very good job of summarizing it, but and when you read it, you tell people what's going to happen at the end, mm-hmm. but it's still a real page turner as you go through it. So what then led you to write this book?
You know, after the trauma had subsided and after I had started rebuilding my life, my husband, so I've remarried, I'm happily remarried. I've got 2 kids. It's great. But my husband said, you have got to write this down. You've got to share the stories. And I'd been thinking for years, what just happened to me? Because I was well educated, you know, I was capable, a fully funded PhD. What happened to me that I found myself so insanely vulnerable? And I thought, is it just me? Am I just one weird data point? Or is there something else more broad going on? So the researcher in me kicked in and I started interviewing widows and divorcees because they find themselves in pretty much the same boat that I was in. Divorce is very similar to loss. And it turns out that there's a lot of commonality. So when I realized that there's something more at play, this isn't just one woman's sob story, that's when I thought, I have to share this. And these women had terrific advice as well. I add that in the book. So I talk not only about what did I learn, so I, kind of stepping back as a researcher, which is what I am fundamentally, and saying, what did I learn here? What just happened? Sharing what I've learned and what I would recommend to others to set yourself up so that you can withstand those kinds of traumatic events. But these other women had tremendous advice as well, and it's all in the book.
So you're not just one weird data point.
I am not one weird data point.
That's
I'm very pleased to say.
Good to know. Good to know.
Yeah.
So, and I would agree with that because obviously in my work, I'm dealing with people who have gone through life events. It
Right.
could be divorce, it could be a loss of a spouse. And when you've got 2 incomes, that's a whole lot different than when you got 1. And that
Yep.
certainly leads to a lot of financial problems. So in the book, you talk about, or maybe this was one of the reviewers who mentioned this, playing the what if game. So, and I know it's not a game, but can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. I do talk about that in the book. It's one of the things that I recommend. Part of what happened to me and part of what I've seen in my work since then and working with families, I spent 10 years working as a financial repair specialist. And part of what I see is that people have no idea how vulnerable they are. And it's not because they are uneducated. It's not because they're dumb. It's just that we go through life and our biggest weaknesses are the ones we're not aware of. That is a mechanism to try to uncover those vulnerabilities. What you do is you simply say, what if? What if my spouse left with the barista from Starbucks around the corner, right? What if I found myself widowed or a widower tomorrow? What would that do to my ability to earn money, to maintain our lifestyle, to deal with the kids? It's a way of approaching your life and putting all sorts of, granted, not fun scenarios on the table and just seeing what impact would that have on me. And that's a heck of a way to uncover the weak spots in your finances.
And that's why people won't do it or don't want to do it,
right.
Because, okay, so you want me to focus on all the bad things that could possibly happen.
Right. And in the book, the point that I make, I think the biggest lesson from all of these people that I interviewed, not one of them saw it coming, whether it's a death. And people said, well, your husband had cancer. Didn't you see it? And at the time, I absolutely did not see it because I was so committed to his wellness, to his rehabilitation, to helping him out. I didn't see it. My case was more obvious, but there are so many stories in the book of women who blindsided, a divorce where suddenly you wake up and your partner, you find out, has been cheating for years, etc. Meanwhile, there was no evidence of that in their life. There's just a bunch of stories in there where I say nobody saw it coming, and that's why it's not fun. But we have to do this.
Yeah. And I always say to people, okay, do you think you're going to be at the same job you're at 50 years from now?
Right.
Well, I never really thought of that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, chances are, no, you won't be. Things are going to change.
You'll have gone through 10 jobs.
Yeah,
in that
probably.
Time.
That's how it typically is.
Yep.
So you got to think ahead. So as a result of that then, and I totally agree with what you're saying, I sit down and I go, okay, what if this happens, this happens, this happens? And your book goes through a lot of examples of things that could go wrong. Mm-hmm. So what then are the planning points I need to put in place when I realize that? So, what if my spouse dies? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a possibility. So what should I be doing now to prepare for that?
When people ask me, how do I protect myself financially? I start with what for me are the 3 non-negotiables. So the very first document is a will that is up to date. So you need a valid will. It needs to be up to date. If you did it 10 years ago, that's great, but you need to revisit it whenever there's something material that changes in your life, or even your executor. Maybe you've lost touch with your executor. You named them, 15 years ago. You haven't talked to them in 10 years.
10 years ago, you didn't have kids.
Right.
That's a different thing.
Yeah. Or you lose somebody. That changes things. So you need a valid will. That's not negotiable. Sufficient insurance. And I say sufficient because everybody goes, yeah, I know we need life insurance. What they don't know is that they need sufficient life insurance. And everybody underestimates how much they actually need. So the value is huge in sitting down with an insurance professional and starting to look at, okay, what's going to happen? And this is where the what if comes in, right? So your husband dies or your wife dies. And now what do you do? Because now you're are you going to go to work the next day? No, you're not going to go to work the next day. How are the kids going to deal with this? What about college? Now you maybe have one income, whereas before you had 2. What do you do about the debt that you've just inherited with all the joint credit cards, etc.? So there's a lot of stuff you look at and you say, if somebody dies, I need to make sure that I have the space to heal, because it honestly took me 2 years to feel human, right after the death of my husband. And that's quite apart from all of the trauma, the financial trauma that I had. So there's a lot of stuff to consider. So that's sufficient insurance is number 2. Number 3 is power of attorney for real estate. So you need to be able to make decisions if your spouse becomes incapacitated. Do you need to access money in your home? Do you need to, remortgage the home? Maybe you've paid off the mortgage. Now you need to slap another mortgage. If you're both on title, you can't do that alone. Do you need to sell the house? So you need the ability to make those decisions in the absence of having your partner around. So those are the top 3. And then there are others if you want to swing for the fences. Disability insurance, another one. Huge for people who are self-employed. Getting your name on as many assets as possible and getting them off as many liabilities as possible. So I go through in my book a huge list of things to consider, but that's where I would start.
And that's good advice. And I like the term sufficient insurance. Obviously, an insurance agent is going to say, well, you need $1 billion.
Right.
Okay, well, I guess if I'm suddenly single, I'm widowed, whatever, well, I want the mortgage to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Do I need $1 billion? Probably not. So
but you know what? I'm going to stop you right there because a lot of people talk about mortgage insurance and they say, oh, I'm good. I've got mortgage insurance. It is not cheap to die. Let me just say that right out of the gate.
It is not cheap to die.
It is not cheap to die, right? It costs a whackload of money. And I put my first husband at his father. We talked about what would be appropriate for him. And we put him in a pine box and everybody drew on the box and it was deeply touching. That was about as cheap as you could go, which is what my husband would have laughed at and loved. Even that cost a small fortune for somebody who had no money at the time, right? I had debts. So it's not cheap to die. Don't just think about the mortgage. You need to think well beyond the mortgage. Start doing the what ifs. So, okay, you've paid off the mortgage. Now what? One of the women I talk about, Barbara, in the book, her husband, professional athlete, drops dead. Height of like full health. She's 8 months pregnant. So it's not just the mortgage. Now she's giving birth to 2 kids who have no money set aside for anything, right? Because before they said, oh, well, we just need to worry about the mortgage. The mortgage isn't enough. So I just want to make that point because a lot of people say to me, I'm good. I've got the mortgage covered. And I said, well, first of all, start with all of the funeral, the burial, all those arrangements and go from there.
Well, and if you're going to be giving birth to twins in a month, how are you paying expenses and all the rest of it? You're probably not working full time during that.
And she's self-employed.
Yeah.
So this is someone I know who's self-employed. So when she stops working, her income stops.
So, and that's why, back to your original point, play the what if game. You got to think through these scenarios and actually play them out in your mind. Yeah. So, okay, now the book is Protect Your Purse, and a purse is something that women use more than men. So obviously this is a book.
Depends on the guy.
I know, nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. So this is obviously directed more at women than at men. Yeah. So I guess question number one, like, what do you got against men? Why are you focusing on the women here?
I get so many men ask me that. They're like, what? Believe it or not, I get as many readers who are male as female because I say money is money. It works the same way. Debt works the same way for everybody. Repaying debt, getting into debt, it's all the same for everybody. The reason I focus on women is because my research from the time this happened to me has uncovered the fact that women are far more financially vulnerable than men, which is before there's an outcry from your readers, not to say that men are not also vulnerable. It's just that there's a huge gap. And it boils down to 2 key things. They earn less and they have less. They earn less, and everybody knows about the well-documented income gap, which is sitting currently roughly 20%. Millennials have it a little bit better, but still there is a gap. So right out of the gate, women are earning less. Of particular interest to me, though, is the wealth gap. So there's a researcher in the U.S. that I found when I started doing digging about what just happened here and how does this work. Her name is Mariko Lin Chang, and she wrote the book Shortchanged: Why Women Have Less Wealth and What Can Be Done About It. And she's the one who demonstrated the wealth gap and why this is a much bigger deal for women. She showed that men have, for every dollar of wealth that men have, and by wealth, very simply, the stuff you have that you could sell for money minus the amount that you owe, that's your wealth, whatever's left, right? And she said that has a much bigger impact on women's ability to be financially resilient, or everybody. For every dollar that men have, women have a mere 36 to 50 cents. So at best, on average, we have half the wealth that men have. And that has significant consequences down the road when stuff happens.
Do you know why that is?
So her book, this is an academic book. She does a great job of looking at many, many factors. She uncovers some of them are built in, they're structural. She talks about the wealth escalator. So men, for example, when a couple has a child, typically, it's the woman who stays at home with the child for some period of time, whatever that period of time is. She talks about the wealth escalator. So guys are on the wealth escalator. They're getting experiences. They're involved in projects. They're maybe getting raises. They're building RRSP. Well, she's an American, so she talked about it from American. But to translate that to Canadian, they're building RRSP room. They're having more investments. The women all this time are off. They're not making the contact. So that just compounds the whole issue of income and wealth. Also, she uncovers the issue of confidence. And that's something that's come up over and over again in my own research. So last year, I talked to 78 women from all across every corner of Canada. And I asked them, listen, where do you feel confident with money? Where do you feel good? You're like, I got this, right? And what areas do you think, oh man, this is not cool. I need some help here. And there's an almost universal lack of confidence. Not across the board. They feel pretty good managing money, but for all of the bigger stuff, they have a tendency to either delegate to the men in their lives, or they simply don't invest. Or when they do invest, they will do stuff like GICs, which they perceive to be very safe because remember, they're terrified of losing money, right? They're like, money's a hard thing to get. If I lose it, it's gone forever, right? Whereas men tend to be a little overconfident. They're like, I lost it, I'll make it back, right? Women are like, that's the end of the world. I've lost it, it's gone forever. So they'll invest in GICs. They barely keep pace and typically not with inflation. So by the time you consider taxation on that interest income and then the impact of inflation, you basically have, they're like, oh, but my principal is guaranteed. Yeah, but the value of your dollar has eroded over time. So something that is in fact considered to be safe by them turns out to be very risky for their future health.
So when you look at the difference between men and women then, so you just mentioned one, confidence, men are overconfident. Right. Women are underconfident, I guess.
And this is not me saying this, by the way. Yeah. This is the data showing this.
Yeah. And that kind of makes sense to what you're saying. Now, you also said money is money. So what are the other differences between men and women? Is confidence the primary one?
Confidence is the primary one that I've seen. So, when you and I were talking, you said, is there any difference between how people handle debt? Debt is debt. You get into it in the same ways. You overspend. You under-earn. It's the same thing for men. It's the same thing for women. Maybe the reasons differ a little bit. Women have a tendency to get into debt when it's not consumer debt. It's to protect their children or as a result of divorce. Right now, they're having to mitigate cash flow deficiencies with credit cards. So maybe there's a tiny difference in terms of the reasons. I won't claim that that's statistically significant. I've not studied it, but really I don't see a difference beyond that.
So what is the solution then? So you obviously advise women. You're running workshops. You've written a book. Yeah. So what is your advice for women then to, bridge this gap, as it were?
One of the things that came out of my research was the need for a safe space for women to learn. Because I'd say to women, why do you feel that you lack confidence? Like, what could you do? And I say, well, do you ask questions? And so when they've got their financial advisor there, for example, their husband does all the talking, they don't ask. Sometimes I was talking to C-level executives. These are highly trained women, and some of them even in areas of finance, who feel stupid by what they don't know. So they clam up. They don't say anything. So there's a twofold, I think, solution to this, which is one, and the reason I created in February a women's money group, which is exclusively for women. It's ongoing education where we tackle different aspects of finances, where women can learn in a safe, non-judgmental environment. In fact, I say, ask all your so-called stupid questions because they are absolutely not stupid. So you give them a safe environment where they can ask their questions, start to build out their financial literacy, grow that depth. And then confidence is built one way and one way only, which is through action. You will never become confident just reading about people who are confident. You might feel more confident, but really the rubber needs to meet the road on that one. So that's about doing. And you need a supportive environment. You need people who are going to be there. If you make a mistake, to say, hey, listen, it's okay. We all make mistakes. You got to get your hands dirty. So if investing is what you fear, learning about it and actually doing it is the way to become more confident. And I can back that up by, just the women I've seen since February who come every single month, and we talk about different aspects of finances, and they're doing stuff because I follow it up with the webinar, and they have goals, right? Tasks that they're off to do. And I've seen them in just a handful of months. You see the difference. You see the difference in how they feel and how much more they talk about money and in what they're doing. And the proof's in the pudding. So it's about doing.
And so if you were to do a seminar that just had men in it, or that had men and women in it, mm-hmm. men would have no problem asking stupid questions?
My experience has been that men have no problem asking questions. So I've not led any seminars or any workshops to date that are co-ed. I'm offering the first one because I had flack from guys who said, hey, listen, we need this too. And a lot of women said, my partner needs this just as much as I do. What I did is I created a co-ed workshop. My first one's going to be in February of 2019. I'll get back to you on that. But what I have seen presenting, so I've done a ton of presenting in the real estate world, the how-to, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And what I can tell you is men have no problem asking questions and the nitty-gritty, or even admitting that they don't know something. Listen, how would you do this? I'm just starting out, right? women have a much harder time. They will come up to me privately and ask those questions. And that's not to say all women, because some are certainly very confident they'll stand up anywhere. They don't care. But there's a huge swath of women who prefer to do this privately so that they don't, I think they're afraid of looking or sounding stupid.
Yeah. And you're right. I guess that's probably a characteristic of men. Okay, I look stupid. I mean, whatever.
I don't think they're worried about looking stupid. I don't think that even crosses their mind. I think they're just like, I want the answer.
Know the answer.
Yeah, like just, I got a question. I need you to answer this for me.
So what you're really saying is don't worry about what everyone else thinks. Like, get on with it.
100%.
Yeah, you 100%. Got a question, just ask it. So.
But I acknowledge, though, that if you've spent a lifetime feeling like you don't have confidence in a particular area, having somebody say, oh, just get on with it, stand up already and ask your question, that's not going to get the job done, right? That's why I have environments where for these women, they feel safe to stand up. And even then, in a room full of women, some of them, like the hand goes up, it's like the micro movement, right? And I see that. And it takes a lot of encouraging. And some women, it took 3-4 meetings for them to finally pipe up and say, I have a question. So it's not enough to just say, all right, just get over it, right?
Yeah. It's got to be a little more than that.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's talk about a couple of other issues here. So in the title of your book here, Shared Lessons for Women, Avoid Financial Messes, Stop Emotional Bankruptcies. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by that? What's an emotional bankruptcy?
In the world of finance, a bankruptcy is when you can no longer service your debt. You're drowning in debt, so you declare bankruptcy. The same concept holds emotionally. So when you go through a financial trauma, it is so overwhelming at times. And I know you've had clients or still have clients who are in that position. I get it because I've been there. It's where there's so much going on. The problems are so severe that you just think, I can't handle this. Like you almost short circuit your brain. My premise in the book is that if you take care of building a strong financial foundation, what you do is you better prepare yourself for those moments when stuff happens in life. And stuff always happens, right? To varying degrees. But if you prepare yourself for that, the emotional impact is far lesser. So you don't have a bankruptcy. You don't have a point where you go, I can't handle this. I just can't take this. My brain's going to explode. It's never fun to go through a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal or a divorce or whatever, a loss of job, an illness. But if you have that solid financial foundation, you're going to say, oh, this is no fun, but I can handle it. And that's the difference right there.
And again, going back to the what if game then, that's really a pretty key component of that as well.
I just want to share one story on that note. I've been working with a lady since the beginning of the group when I first launched the group, and she at the time was about to leave her husband. It's an unsafe environment at home. And so she came up to me and she said, what do I need to do to protect myself, to prepare myself? I gave her a list and I said, well, first thing is you need to open your own bank account because they had joint everything. And anyway, so I gave her a list of things to do. Fast forward 9 months later, she has been through, so they have separated. She has gone through some very unsafe moments for herself and her child. But she came back to me and she said, I was speaking with my counselor. She has a counselor and she has a divorce lawyer. And both of them sat her down initially at their first meeting and said, you know what, this is not going to be fun, but here's what we need you to do. This is going to be super hard. And they gave her a list of things. And she said, I took one look at the list and I was like, nope, did that, got that. I'll have that for you by tomorrow. And she walked out of there. She said, I felt like $1 million. So she said, it's been so hard to go through this, but I realize it could have been so much worse if I weren't prepared. That's the difference between an emotional bankruptcy and just an emotional impact, right? The trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting your point about bank accounts because every single client who comes in to see us, we say exactly the same thing. Well,
right.
If you're going to end up going bankrupt, you can't, and you owe money to Bank ABC, you can't still be banking at Bank ABC. Right. And joint accounts are certainly an issue as well. So yeah, that's kind of a basic procedure. And it's like, well, it's a bit of a hassle. I got to do this and I got to go over there and I got to have ID and they want to think I'm a terrorist and all the rest of it. And
it's going to be a bigger hassle if they don't.
Yeah, but it's going to be a bigger hassle if they don't. It's pretty much as simple as that. So now we talked about the wealth gap and the income gap, and I think we've covered that. How in your mind the wealth gap is even a bigger problem than the income gap, and
they're both a problem. Let's just be clear. Yeah,
and I guess one kind of leads to the other. Then, right? The income gap kind of leads to the wealth gap, and so back to what the practical advice on that one was. Can you state that again for us then? So if I'm sitting there and I'm worried that, wealth is a problem, income is a problem.
Yeah.
And so it's not as simple as to say, well, you got to get a better job or something like that.
Right.
What are the practical steps then that can be taken to help alleviate that? Is it again what you said, you got to play the what if game, you got to take concrete steps, or? That
depends. I'm not sure what your question is. Is your question about how to protect themselves financially? Yeah. So put those documents in place. But if they're looking and saying, okay, so I've got the documents in place. Now the question is, do I have debt or don't I have debt, right? Because those are two very different scenarios. If you have debt, that becomes your most pressing problem. And you and I were talking a little bit about, is wealth really the bigger determinant of financial resilience than income? Listen, if you do not have enough income to pay for the necessities of life, what you physiologically need, that is your highest priority. But assuming that you have enough income for that, the question becomes, okay, what now? So do you have money habits that are leading you and keeping you in debt? That's your next biggest priority. Because there's no point saving if you've got credit card debt. If you're paying 18 to 25% interest, no sane investment is ever going to yield that. And if your Uncle Bob comes and offers you that, walk away, right? No, run away.
Yeah.
So you gotta deal with that first.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I get people come in here and they've got all this credit card debt, but they've got $3,000 in their TFSA.
Right.
Okay, well, you're earning 0% in your TFSA, but you got 20% credit card debt.
I would argue, so here's what I would do. I would automate something, a trivial amount of money to develop that muscle and that habit into the TFSA. So you know what? $20 a month is not going to kill you, right? Do that if only to develop that muscle of saying, no, saving and investing is a priority. I would absolutely do that. But if you've got credit card debt and consumer debt that is outpacing what you would ever earn in an investment, you have to tackle that first. People say, okay, so I'm going to do that first and then look elsewhere. I was like, no, but you need to make sure that you kick it to the curb, right? This isn't just pay off my debt, because what I've seen happen with clients is that I work with them for 2 to 4 years. I don't do that anymore, by the way. But when I worked with them, I would hold their hand, put together a plan, and they would pay off tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, get into fantastic shape. I let go of their hand. I say, hey, good job, you guys. Congratulations. And then they revert back into the old patterns and they slide right back into debt. So what I've realized, it's not enough to pay off debt. You need to figure out what got you into debt in the first place. Because there's those patterns, those beliefs, that you need to root up and say, okay, we need to change those. Once you do that, then to narrow that wealth gap, narrowing the wealth gap starts with paying off debt, but then you need to learn how to invest. And that's the critical thing, to learn how to grow your money.
Yeah.
And it's not rocket science.
No, going on a diet for 3 months is great. But if you go back to doing what you're doing before,
right,
then you've kind of defeated the purpose.
Exactly.
So, and obviously that's why my firm exists. If you've got so much debt that you can never hope to pay it back
right,
off, then okay, you've got to do a proposal, a bankruptcy, something to clean it up. So now you say there are no stupid questions.
Right.
I could probably come up with some stupid questions, but
Pretty sure they're not stupid.
We won't go there. How much should I put into Bitcoin? That'd be a good question there.
0 or 0?
Yeah, there you go. So what are the top questions about debt that you get asked?
The very first one that comes out of so all of the women that I interviewed, I asked them, what questions would you have me answer for you? If you had access to me full time, what's the very first 5 questions? And the first one that came out of so many women was, should I pay off debt or should I save money? Right? And that's the number one question that I get asked. And they're paralyzed into inaction because they don't know. They're afraid of making the wrong choice. So they don't do anything. And I say, look, both is great, right? So both are great. So you can save money, you can pay off, and nobody's going to go, oh, well, that was a dumb thing to do. But if you're asking me which is most effective, then back to the debt. What is the debt? If it's a 3% mortgage on your house, it may be worth it to you. Pay that off. But invest, right? Because that's going to give you a much bigger bang for your buck, assuming you're doing investing with research-based approach, etc. If you have credit card debt, it's a no-brainer. That has to go. So you start there, but that's by far and away the number one question. The second question that I get asked is, how'd you pay off $400,000 in 2 years? Everybody wants to know that. I answer that question in my book. I go through the steps, what I did, and in a nutshell, what it is, I deprived myself of everything for 2 years, which I wouldn't do that in the same way if I had to do it again, because that's just a great way to bleed your soul dry. But I deprived myself of everything. I sold everything that I could. But what really made a difference is cranking up the income. And I find that when people are dealing with debt, the easiest thing for them to do is to look at, how do I cut back on my expenses? Because cutting the cable bill, that's fast, may be painful, may be annoying, but it's relatively easy to do. Figuring out how to grow your income is not easy to do, but it pays off huge dividends on an ongoing basis. So I got really creative, as you probably read in my book, about what I needed to do with what was left of the business. That going for the big wins is by far and away what's going to help you pay off massive debts in a hurry. And then finally, the question I get asked is, how do I pay off debt? People just want a blueprint for how to pay off debt. And now what I teach, knowing what I know after 20 years of dealing with this and researching this, start with your values. Figure out, what do you really value? Because I find a lot of people who are, debt reduction specialists will just try a one-size-fits-all approach. Well, first you got to cut back this, and you chop out that. No, you don't. You absolutely don't. You can be perfectly successful, but you need to figure out what matters to you. What are your non-negotiable values, right? So maybe you keep the pedicure every 2 months because it makes you feel fabulous. It feeds your soul, but you cut mercilessly on those things that do not go into your values. So people will say, well, cut out the gym membership. Maybe, but maybe not. So if you start looking at your line items, all of your expenses, and saying, is this congruent with my values, my top 3 to 5 values? You can very easily start to identify, you know what? No, that isn't congruent with my values. And even if they all are, you might say, my house, it's essential, but a $600,000 house is not essential, right? Then you start saying, okay, so these items here are congruent with my values. And then you start evaluating them and saying, am I happy with the amount I'm spending in these different areas? Do they need to be increased? Am I not spending enough on my health, for example? Or do they need to be decreased? I teach a values-based approach, and that has by far and away been the most effective strategy that I've ever seen or employed.
Well, and I think that also still comes back to the what if thing too.
What
so what if I gave up this and didn't give up this? What's most important? And I think a lot of the time there's inertia. Well, I've always done it that way,
right?
And so I'm gonna keep doing it that way.
I'll just say that for a lot of the clients, when I said to them, "What do you think that you could cut out?" If I had $1 for every time somebody said, "I honestly can't see what I'd cut out because I've cut back as much as I can." We're simply not aware of what we spend and where. So one of the best ways to uncover that is to track everything. And it's tedious, I know that, but if you track everything for 3 months, you might say, I don't spend that much on wine. I use wine as an example.
Hypothetical example,
hypothetically,
I understand, yes.
Speaking about a friend here.
Yes.
But I don't spend that much on wine. And then when you actually start tracking, you're like, holy smokes, I actually do. Tracking reveals everything that we're not aware of. Those little blind spots, that's a great way to take a look and say, you know what? Back to the values and back to the what if. Is this the best use of my money? Is this going to get me where I want to go?
Yeah, and a simple way to do that is pay for everything with your debit card. So it's all on your bank statement. You don't have to save every single receipt. So that's one way to do it. So, well, I think that's fantastic advice, and we're up against the clock here. So, can you tell people how they can find you? What's the website? How can they get the book? Where can they track you down?
Sure. So the book, the simplest place to go is Amazon. It's available in Canada.amazon.ca, Amazon.com in the US and the UK as well. I am at yourfinanciallaunchpad.com. That's my website. It's being completely revamped, so sometime soon it's going to look fantastic. But they can find that there. I write a blog, and if they want money tips, I send out money tips once a week to my mailing list. So they just shoot me off an email, doris@yourfinanciallaunchpad.com. I'll get them on there.
Excellent. Well, Doris, thanks very much for being here.
My pleasure.
So Doris is the author of Protect Your Purse, and as she said, it's available on Amazon. I actually read it on Kindle, so you can get it on Kindle as well. Protect Your Purse, shared lessons for women, avoid financial messes, stop emotional bankruptcies, and take charge of your money. As always, I'll post a full transcript of today's show and complete show notes, including links to Doris's website and her book, over at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Until next week, thanks for listening. I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.